In Parker Lewis's 2023 book, Gradually Then Suddenly, which evolved from a collection of essays that he had written in 2019, he lays out the case that Bitcoin represents a paradigm shift in global finance. He argues that Bitcoin's adoption and impact on the financial system will unfold, as Ernest Hemingway explained all major change does, in two phases. First, gradually, as people incrementally learn about Bitcoin's value, technology, and the potential to address the problems in the world facilitated by fiat currencies, but that there will come a tipping point when its acceptance and transformative effect accelerate rapidly. With the establishment of the U.S. Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, have we finally reached the point where we have left gradually behind us?
This podcast is for information and entertainment purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as financial advice. All views expressed on this podcast are solely the opinions of the host and/or any guests that we might have from time to time. Nothing on this podcast should be construed as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or to follow a particular investing strategy.
Guten Tag, buenos dias, Morian, and welcome to episode 206 of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. This is a special edition. We normally do our DCA Wednesday series on Wednesday. From time to time, we've done an emergency podcast to cover breaking news or a weekend update to discuss the news of the week, and this is kind of a blend of the two of those. The whirlwind week we spoke about just a couple of days ago certainly continued. Of course, first we had been told that there was going to be a strategic crypto reserve and not just a Bitcoin reserve, and that reserve was going to contain freaking Ripple and Cardano, etc. And then an unlikely opposition to adding S-coins to the SBR started to emerge, with people like the Winklevoss twins and even Brian freaking Armstrong advocating that the reserve be Bitcoin only. And then we were told an announcement was going to be made at the White House Crypto Summit on Friday, but that Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick let us know that there were going to be two different reserves and that Bitcoin was going to be treated differently than the altcoins. And then on Thursday, just a day after that last DCA Wednesday episode we did, and a day before the White House Summit even, President Donald Trump signed an executive order establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve and a separate crypto asset stockpile with dramatically different rules for the two. And of course, then the price tanked 5% on the news. All right, we are going to break this all down in this special episode of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. But first, in keeping with tradition, let's take a quick peek at least a couple of Bitcoin's vital statistics. At the time of this recording, we are sitting at a block height of 886,933, and Bitcoin is ringing in at a US dollar value of 86,300 US dollars per Bitcoin. And if you remember, we stacked at 91,595 US dollars on Wednesday, so about 5% cheaper on a sell the news event after the announcement of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. But that means that every fiat dollar that you'll convert to Bitcoin right now, if you choose to buy the dip, will mean that you will receive 1,159 Satoshis per cuck buck. And so that's nice that it is significantly cheaper than 1,000 sats per Bitcoin to purchase right now. Bitcoin's current price gives it a market cap of 1.71 trillion, still about on par with silver's market cap. And for every ounce of gold that you have, it will take 29.4 of them to purchase just a single Bitcoin, as of course gold continues to trend to zero in Bitcoin terms. Before I get into the important news of the day, I do want to take a quick moment to thank those of you listening on your favorite Podcasting 2.0 apps, such as Fountain. Podcasting 2.0 allows you to support this podcast through the value for value method by either streaming sats on a minute-by-minute basis as you listen, or by sending a boost, which is a shout-out via a Lightning transaction, where you can let us know what you think about the podcast, what you like, maybe what you don't like, what you'd like to see covered in the future. Let us know what's going on in your community or just something in your life, or even just say hello. But because it is a Lightning transaction, you are sending value back to the podcast in form of Satoshis. You should also listen on Fountain if you're not already, because Fountain allows you to actually earn Satoshis for listening to your favorite podcasts. I earned 180 sats last night for listening to a Stephen Livera podcast episode. And you can either stack those sats or you can send those sats back to the podcast that you feel provide you the most value. And of course, when we do receive boosts, we read them on the upcoming episode of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. On to that news. White House crypto czar David Sachs announced the signing of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Executive Order on X or Twitter, tweeting at the time, "Just a few minutes ago, President Trump signed an executive order to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The reserve will be capitalized with Bitcoin owned by the federal government that was forfeited as part of criminal or civil asset forfeiture proceedings. This means it will not cost taxpayers a dime. It was estimated that the U.S. government owns about 200,000 Bitcoin. However, there has never been a complete audit. The executive order also directs a full accounting of the federal government's digital asset holdings. The U.S. will not sell any Bitcoin deposited into the reserve. It will be kept as a store of value. The reserve is like a digital Fort Knox for the cryptocurrency often called digital gold. Premature sales of Bitcoin have already cost U.S. taxpayers over $17 billion in lost value. Now, the federal government will have a strategy to maximize the value of its holdings. The Secretary of Treasury and Commerce are authorized to develop budget-neutral strategies for acquiring additional Bitcoin, provided that those strategies have no incremental cost on American taxpayers. In addition, the executive order establishes a U.S. digital asset stockpile consisting of digital assets other than Bitcoin forfeited in criminal or civil proceedings. The government will not acquire additional assets for the stockpile beyond those forfeiture proceedings. The purpose of the stockpile is responsible stewardship of the government's digital assets under the Treasury Department. Promises made, promises kept. President Trump promised to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve and a digital asset stockpile. Those promises have been kept. This executive order underscores President Trump's commitment to making the U.S. the crypto capital of the world. I want to thank the president for his leadership and vision in supporting this cutting-edge technology and for his rapid execution in supporting the digital asset industry. His administration is truly moving at, quote, tech speed. I want to thank the president's working group on digital assets, especially Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, for their help in support in getting this done. Finally, Bo Hines played a critical role as executive director of our working group. Well, this had an immediate and quite amazing reaction, with multiple people breaking out to Twitter and other social media to express their opinions. Balaji, for example, described the executive order in a tweet on X, saying, "This executive order is historic. It focuses primarily on Bitcoin. It costs U.S. taxpayers nothing, and it saves billions by not selling. Just very tightly written, including the clear distinction between Bitcoin and other digital assets. Well done." Well, as I mentioned, the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve was a sell the news event, with Bitcoin dropping from about $90,000 right before the announcement to about $85,000. In fact, I saw it dip below $85,000 briefly. I think it was on Cash App when I was looking, trying to catch the dip, stack a little bit of extra Bitcoin that, of course, we don't include in our DCA Wednesday stack. We want to keep, if you do follow us on DCA Wednesdays, we keep that stack segregated because we want to explore, test the hypothesis of dollar cost average. And of course, while I always personally like to buy the dip, that would taint that would taint our data. So it is included in our DCA Wednesday stack. But nonetheless, I was watching intently, and I noticed that Bitcoin had dipped around 84 something. I did not catch that dip, but like many of you, I was able to purchase $85,000 Bitcoin. And of course, Bitcoin's trended in the $85,000 or $86,000 range pretty much since the announcement. Of course, we're in the middle of the weekend, and weekends traditionally have significantly lower volume, which can lead to significant more volatility. Oftentimes, Bitcoin trends down over the weekend only to pop back up on Monday, or maybe makes big shocking moves up on the weekend as well. Because they're all the normal Monday through Friday traders, the Wall Street types, are not active on the weekend. It's just us plebs. So the lower volume, it equals greater volatility. So I guess, like as I was saying, it wouldn't be out of the question to see Bitcoin dip lower than $85,000 or $84,000 over the weekend. But one thing is certain, as I quote Adam Meister at TechBalt on Twitter all the time. Adam Meister always says Bitcoin always returns to its all-time high. And of course, I've dedicated multiple episodes to explaining why I believe that this bull run really hasn't even gotten started yet. That if history repeats or even rhymes, that the big face-melting bull run won't happen until this summer or this fall. I heard Matt Odell multiple times describe this as the most disappointing bull run so far, the most disappointing cycle so far in Bitcoin's history. I would respectfully disagree with Odell because a lot of people that are drawing that conclusion are looking at the chart that goes from the halving price and not from the cycle low. And this time around was different. Right before the halving, we had a new all-time high because of the Golden Swan event of the ETFs being approved. And so we had a huge bump where you normally wouldn't. So if you had looked at an average cycle, what it should look like, it should have pretty much started at the cycle low, not at a brand new all-time high. So if you look at the charts that measure from the cycle low, we're performing incredibly well already. And as I've mentioned multiple times, that chart pretty much mirrors 2017. Where in 2017, Bitcoin hung around the $1,000 mark for months and didn't really get ripping until July when it was in the $4,000 range in July or the beginning of August. And then in September, October, November, it just shot ballistic up to that $20,000 cycle all-time high. And so far, at least in my opinion, this cycle is still very, very reminiscent of 2017, with the minor exception that we've had so many more positive announcements, so many huge positive developments like the ETFs, like potentially looking at nation state FOMO now, with nation states already stacking Bitcoin, but with this being really the official starting gun that the big boys are now getting involved in that race. And of course, we've seen more companies follow MicroStrategy's strategy of adding Bitcoin to their treasury. And so there are plenty of reasons why not only are we repeating 2017, we're primed to have an even more impressive cycle than 2017. So nobody has the crystal ball, and I don't either, but that's just my hunch. But remember, in general, previous halving-driven bull markets have peaked about 18 months or so after the halving. For example, the 2016 halving peaked in December of 2017, and then the 2020 halving kind of had that double top, but its ultimate peak at $69,000 all-time high for that cycle, before the ETFs, just before the next halving, was in November of 2021. And that was a month sooner than the December all-time high in 2017. But as I've spent a fair amount of detail in previous podcasts explaining, Bitcoin works in terms of block time, the time chain time, not human time. And because more hash power has been added to the network and the hash rate has been going up and to the right, just like Bitcoin's price, that we have seen the halving come about a month earlier every year. And as a result, if you measure from the halving to the all-time high, even though the all-time high in 2021 was a month earlier than it was in 2017, well, so was the halving. So it was about the same distance from the halving. If that trend holds, if blocks keep coming in a little bit faster than normal, like they have been, then maybe we'll see the end of September or the beginning of October before this cycle peaks. But again, nobody has a crystal ball, and it is certainly going to be fun to see. And buckle up, because bull runs are fun, but the euphoria phase, it's called the euphoria phase for a reason, and it's just exciting. That's when it's a really a fun time to be a Bitcoiner, and it's why people make those obscene overestimations like 200K by conference day, just out of pure unadulterated euphoria. All right. Getting back to the SBR, reacting to the announcement of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, Rich Dad Poor Dad author tweeted his reaction to the SBR executive order and subsequent price dip by tweeting, "President Trump signs Bitcoin Strategic Reserve. Sellers are losers. Will be buying more Bitcoin." Bit influencer Nico reacted on Twitter as well, saying $500,000 Bitcoin in 2025. Maybe that's true. There are people certainly calling for 500,000 or more, or maybe that's an example of euphoria setting a little early. But if we are repeating 2017, $1 million Bitcoin is not out of the question. I mean, remember, we saw Bitcoin 20x from the cycle low in the 2016, 2017 halving cycle. And if Bitcoin were to 20x this time around from the cycle low of around 14,000, 15,000 US dollars, that would certainly be significantly more than we're currently sitting at right now. Samson Mao, who has repeatedly called for $1 million Bitcoin this cycle, tweeted in response to the SPR, $1 million Bitcoin in 2025 doesn't sound so crazy now, does it? And Block DYOR replied to Exelon, everything's unfolding as expected. Sell the news event, just like when the ETF approval news hit last year. This means God candles are loading. Omega candles too. Of course, God candles referring to the $10,000 Bitcoin candles, and Omega candles presumably would be 100,000 US dollar daily candles. And we've had a couple of those quote unquote God candles. In fact, look, last week we had the $10,000 daily candle up, and then the next day the 10,000 daily candle down. So twin mirror God candles within a 24-hour period. Astute observers probably noticed that the separate quote unquote digital asset stockpile did not in fact include XRP. BitPain tweeted, Trump literally rugged the ruggers. Beautiful. Pierre Rochard tweeted, at Eleanor Terrett and at Real Donald Trump, wow, so XRP's only hope is that Ripple commits so much crime that the government seizes their XRP. And seemingly, since the government doesn't currently hold any Ripple, at least that we know about, that because who commits crime with that worthless token, that there will be no XRP in the digital asset stockpile. And so poor Brad Garlinghouse now has to be hoping that scammers will adopt his crap coin. Pierre Rochard followed that up with another tweet saying, this aged very poorly. Brad's plan backfired, and now XRP is relegated to the quote-unquote sell-only bucket. He would have been better off staying quiet. I do want to remind you that when people were first panicking about the possibility of including XRP in any strategic reserve, I said on the record, in quite a lot of detail actually, that I believe there was basically zero chance, that there was no way that Donald Trump would allow a man who had stabbed him in the back, who had repeatedly gone all in to help Kamala Harris defeat him, but there was no way Donald Trump would allow him to have any sway over his administration whatsoever. In fact, I went into that in quite a bit of detail on episode 200 on January 29th. So let's take it was about a 5-minute segment. So I'm going to break it down in just a few seconds. So here's what I said on January 29th when I predicted that there was zero chance XRP was going to be held in the strategic reserve. So personally, I think XRP is a non-starter. Donald Trump, maybe he doesn't know, but when it's brought to his attention, will probably hate Brad Garlinghouse with a passion that only Donald Trump can feel. And we've already seen that in his actions, that the retaliations he's taken, the in-your-face attitude he's taken to those who were standing in his way or stood his way in the past. So I wouldn't worry too much about SRP. All right. So let's take a look at the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve and see exactly how it differs from the digital asset stockpile. First, the SPR states that the US government will never sell its Bitcoin. The Digital Asset Reserve, on the other hand, allows for the sale of the altcoins held by the government. Remember, as the crypto czar said, that the simple purpose of the digital asset stockpile is to consolidate and coordinate custody of digital assets that the government had seized, because there were plenty of headlines recently that said things like the U.S. Marshals had no idea how much Bitcoin we had. Maybe it had been lost. Really, there was no accountability in how the U.S. government's Bitcoin, how the taxpayers' Bitcoin was being stored. And so really that's what the digital asset stockpile does. It organizes everything that's not Bitcoin under one umbrella and keeps track of it in a better manner. Also, the SPR seeks to find ways to add more Bitcoin, whereas the digital asset stockpile does not. It says that the only way, for example, that more coins will be added to the DAS is that if they're seized in civil proceedings or criminal proceedings. Vijay Boyapati summed up these differences in a tweet. And I guess that tweet was on Thursday. saying BTC in reserve won't be sold. Shitcoins in digital asset stockpile can be sold. Treasury can suggest budget neutral ways of increasing BTC in reserve, aka selling shitcoins and gold. This is a bit of a trick with just an executive order establishing, purchasing more Bitcoin, adding Bitcoin to the strategic Bitcoin reserve, because, in the United States, spending is authorized by Congress. Congress has the so-called power of the purse. Now, the executive branch has some authority over how that spending is doled out. They're the executive. They're like the chief executive officer of a company. The budget items, the major expenditures have to be authorized by the board of directors, in this case, the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Congress. But the CEO or the chief executive officer or the managing partner, depending on the company's structure, has the day-to-day authority to dole that money out. So to that end, VJ's tweet said the Treasury can, quote unquote, suggest budget neutral ways to buy additional Bitcoin, but this may seem like a small point of order, but that's not what the executive order says. The executive order doesn't say may. The executive order uses the word shall suggest. And that means they are directed to come up with suggestions on how to purchase more Bitcoin, not that they have the option to. American HODL explained the difference between shall and may in the executive order in a post on Twitter following the announcement of the executive order, saying, quote, "This is an explicit edict for Treasury to create strategies to buy Bitcoin. Right now, it is literally illegal for Treasury not to develop a strategy to buy Bitcoin. The U.S. government will be buying Bitcoin." Matthew Pines tweeted, one second, having an issue with my show notes setup. Matthew Pines tweeted about the some of the larger implications of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve executive order by saying, quote, "Because there is a fixed supply of BTC, there is a strategic advantage to being among the first nations to create a strategic Bitcoin reserve. This will be printed out and placed on the desk of every national leader, central bank head, and finance minister in the world tomorrow." And this is a big deal. And of course, it's important to remember that the United States is not the first country to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Obviously, we've spoken about El Salvador in length ever since they announced that they would be going on a Bitcoin standard at the Bitcoin conference in Miami several years ago. But the US is the first G20 nation, the first quote unquote big boy on the block, the first world leader, in many ways, the biggest superpower in the world, the biggest economic power in the world. And they're announcing the strategic Bitcoin reserve. While El Salvador and Nayib Bukele were the first, it is easy to understand why the United States jumping on the bandwagon would carry more weight, would be of more significance, even if to us plebs, us Bitcoiners, we give that credit to President Bukele. Bitcoin Inc. CEO David Bailey, they're responsible for the Bitcoin conferences and for Bitcoin Magazine, tweeted 100% Trump's Louisiana purchase, talking about or signifying the significance of the purchase or the establishment of the strategic Bitcoin reserve. For those who don't know, the Louisiana Purchase was when Thomas Jefferson purchased a large chunk of territory from France that basically was the entire western United States, except for the territory in California and Texas and New Mexico that was controlled by Spain. But it was it more than doubled the size of the United States. And it would go on to be recognized as one of the more significant moments in U.S. history. And it's not hard to understand why the strategic Bitcoin reserve, kicking off nation state FOMO, could have that kind of significance as well. It certainly will be something that Trump will go down in the history books for, regardless of whatever else happens during his administration. Love him or hate him, he will always be the president who established the United States strategic Bitcoin reserve. Replying to a tweet by BitPain and BitKelt, emphasizing the historic significance of the SBR, I guess replying to a tweet by BitPain, BitKelt tweeted, "Agreed. If in 2009 or even 2023, someone told you that the USA would be legitimizing and distinguishing Bitcoin as an asset worthy of a reserve, what would you have said? The announcement yesterday was historic for a number of reasons. The foundation has been set." Look, one cycle ago, we were talking about Wall Street adoption. We were talking about the big money coming in. We were talking about, ETFs maybe being a thing that would happen one day, that companies would start adding Bitcoin to their balance sheet, that maybe pensions would get involved. And that was really going to be a big deal because, they have more money to invest than us plebs do. But countries bring that to a whole nother level. This really is a big moment. Mark my words. The rest of the world is watching, even if countries like in the EU or wherever, decide that they're going to try and resist, that they're going to mock Bitcoin and mock Donald Trump. Eventually, they too will be forced to bend the knee, to bow to the strategic reserve, whether they do so at first secretly or whether they just say, screw it, we're all in, and compete openly in that FOMO. The establishment of the SBR also has other important effects. Whale Panda pointed out, for example, on Twitter, now your parents and uncles who quote unquote know better and that claim that Bitcoin will never be legitimate, have any real value, or that the US will ban it, have no excuses anymore not to own digital gold. Wild to see this on an executive order. Whale Panda is exactly right. I've even mentioned this in the past several times that when I've been trying to orange pill people, I've got one or two friends that I've been trying to orange pill for more than 5 or 6 years. And that without a doubt, every single one of them at some point in time had said, regardless how cool Bitcoin is, the US government will never let it exist. The governments are going to squash Bitcoin and it's just going to fail. And I was not able to convince them otherwise in many cases. But it'd be hard to argue that the US is going to squish Bitcoin now when the US has said that it's going to be its strategic asset, that they're going to stock it like they stock the gold in Fort Knox. So that is an important point. Not only does this kick off nation state FOMO, it clarifies for a lot of the normies out there that Bitcoin isn't just a Ponzi scheme, that Bitcoin isn't fairy dust, it isn't just nerd money, and that it isn't something that governments are going to ban, that governments have now embraced it. The largest, most powerful country in the world, not largest by people. I know the US is just a drop in the bucket population wise compared to like China and India, but the largest economic power, largest military power in the world, who exerts their authority, who flexes that authority all over the world, trying to influence how other governments govern their people, what other policies that other governments around the world institute. Well, that pressure's gone now because the US is now not only Bitcoin friendly, the US has officially joined the ranks of being a Bitcoiner. That is wild. And as Whale Panda said, certainly wild to see on an executive order. Don't forget Senator Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming. She reminded us in a tweet saying this is only the beginning because, of course, remember, Cynthia Lummis has already introduced her bill into the United States Senate, which would enshrine a strategic Bitcoin reserve into law. That is something that would give this a little more permanence because what Trump started, was with executive order. So that means that when Donald Trump's not president anymore in 4 years, regardless who the president is, if that president is not Bitcoin friendly, well, they can simply, with a stroke of a pen, undo that executive order. There would obviously be a lot of political pressure not to do so, but it is within the realm of possibility. So by pushing Cynthia Lummis's bill or a similar bill through the Congress, that will make the strategic Bitcoin reserve more permanent. And hopefully that's something we see happen. But now we have some breathing room. It doesn't have to happen this year, as long as it happens in the next 4 years, or if we end up with a Bitcoiner for president 4 years from now. There's a little bit more breathing room because we've started the stockpile, and I firmly believe when that stockpile goes to the freaking moon, it's going to get a lot easier to get a congressional bill passed when it's become just so. I mean, it's already pretty obvious when the executive order mentioned that the United States lost $17 billion in potential gains by selling the Bitcoin they've already sold. I think that already illustrates that point. But now the clock is ticking from when the SBR has officially become a thing. And like I said, this was going to be the cycle that vindicates Michael Saylor, MicroStrategy. This was going to be the cycle that vindicated El Salvador. Maybe it'll be another cycle to truly vindicate the United States. But since we got in early, since I believe the real bull run hasn't happened, I mean, it's possible Bitcoin 10 or 20x's this year. And if it does, let's say Bitcoin hits 1 million. Let's say Bitcoin hits 2 million this cycle. The value of that strategic reserve will be more than 10x, possibly 20x what it is today. And I think that will be a major wake-up call for the remaining holdouts in the Congress who are anti-Bitcoin still. Of course, most of them are anti-Bitcoin purely for political purposes. Another significance of Trump establishing the SPR is this is kind of officially going to draw the line in the sand, because we have basically the two-party system here in the United States where Republicans have started lining up as pro-Bitcoin. And now that Trump is pro-Bitcoin, there are some people whose entire living, the only reason they're elected to Congress is to just be the no guy, to oppose Trump. And so obviously, even if they were smart enough to realize that Bitcoin's potential, some of them are going to be anti-Bitcoin just because that's their job. Kind of like Peter Schiff. He'll never be pro-Bitcoin because he owns a gold company. He makes his living selling people gold. It's like the saying that you know, nobody will ever admit something if their livelihood depends on it not being true. Alistair Milne had an interesting tweet on Twitter today. It was one of those how it started, how it's going tweets. And the how it started is the magic internet money wizard from Reddit. I know the wizard concept has just got kind of tainted, kind of leaves a bad taste in your mouth now because of this taproot morons pretending they're the taproot wizards. But the wizard really represents Bitcoin, and it started with the Reddit subreddit Bitcoin, and the logo, the little JPEG of a Bitcoin wand wielding wizard saying magic internet money. So how it started was with our Bitcoin and the cartoon wizard, and how it's going is a screenshot of the executive order cover page from the White House website saying establishment of the strategic Bitcoin reserve and the United States digital asset stockpile. And you know, from a bunch of from nerd money to a government stockpile in just a few short years is truly mind-boggling when you stop and put it into perspective. And that gets on to what I was talking about in the introduction to the show, the gradually and suddenly moment. Have we reached that tipping point? You know, I guess we'll only know in hindsight, but it sure feels like we're living in a totally different world than we were living in just 2 weeks ago. Maybe a totally different world than we were living before the Biden administration sunset and the Trump administration came in and fired all the anti-Bitcoin army in the administration, and it started appointing Bitcoin-friendly executives, Bitcoin-friendly cabinet members, and Bitcoin-friendly policies. But it's one of those things. I guess you really won't know the end of the old system until you look back in the history books. But this really feels like it's going to be that point. Michael Saylor, of course, tweeted, the U.S. now has the world's largest strategic Bitcoin reserve. So we mentioned El Salvador was first, but with a stroke of a pen, the U.S. has just lapped them in size. Of course, El Salvador is a small country. There's like 5 or 6 million people in El Salvador. That's not even one of the biggest cities in the United States. I mean, that's a good sized city, but not even the largest city in the United States. And that's their entire population. So El Salvador is really punching above their weight class, stocking the amount of Bitcoin they have. It was never realistic that they would be able to outcompete the United States once the bidding war started. That's why it was so important that they front run the United States. So important that the small guys were first. It's often, like I said, when I was talking about you previously had the opportunity to front run the United States, to front run a strategic Bitcoin reserve, that the longer government stalled in embracing Bitcoin, the more Satoshis, us plebs, had the opportunity to stock. And those days are over, or ending soon. I mean, it's only going to be a matter of time before just a couple of big superpower countries need to pile in and get in this competition. And remember, there's only 21 million Bitcoin. There's not enough Bitcoin for every millionaire to have even one. There's something like 60 million millionaires in the world, and if every millionaire wanted to own an equal share of Bitcoin, it means they could only own a third of a Bitcoin at most. Well, countries are certainly more wealthy than all the millionaires, and that means they're not going to be stacking single Bitcoins. They're going to be trying stacking hundreds of Bitcoins or thousands of Bitcoins, and the only way they're going to be able to do that is by outbidding on the free market, because I'm not going to sell my Bitcoin. There's only so many Bitcoin left to be mined, and they're going to be mined, you know, for years and years and years to come. So as Bitcoin on the market gets more and more scarce and more big players are trying to sap it up, that's why I'm saying, buckle up. If Matt Odell thinks this is the most disappointing cycle so far, man, I honestly feel he's going to be eating those words hard in just a few months. But I guess only time will tell. Michelle Weekly put this into perspective with a tweet that I have retweeted under our @BTC Bulletin Pod handle on Twitter. Again, you should be following us on @BTC on Twitter at BTC Bulletin Pod. If you're not, we don't have that many followers, so probably you are not following us on Twitter. Maybe you're not using Twitter, in which case you should be following us on Nostr, because we're on Nostr as well. But I don't tweet a lot on Twitter, but I do tweet out the things I talk about in this podcast. And since you're listening on audio, if you want to see those charts, then you can scroll through our Twitter. And in this case, this is a graph that shows Bitcoin holdings by country, and it shows the United States holding 112,189 Bitcoin. It's been estimated that's as high as 200,000 Bitcoin. I think the discrepancy here, though, is that some of those Bitcoin were from the Bitfinex hack, and because they're stolen property, they are the rightful property of Bitfinex. So you have to hopefully they'll be getting their Bitcoin back. It's like if your car is stolen and the police pull the person over in the car and they seize it and then just keep it. That'd be uncool. You want your car back, right? Unless it's really trashed. But the point being, you want your stolen property back. So after the BTC is returned to Bitfinex, that leaves us with more like 112,189 Bitcoin. The United Kingdom, it's estimated holds 61,000 Bitcoin. China is estimated holds 194,000 Bitcoin. So if the number of 112,000 for the United States is true, that would actually make China the largest holder. Even Ukraine holds 46,351 Bitcoin. And Bhutan, of course, speaking of small nations that are hitting above their weight class, hold 13,029 Bitcoin, which isn't too shabby, and they're just only getting started. And of course, El Salvador holds approximately 6,089 Bitcoin. Of course, there were haters and deniers right up to the moment the executive order was signed. I find this personally funny because literally just minutes before we learned that the SBR had been established, less than an hour before the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve was signed, people were poo-pooing that it'll never happen on Twitter, to include Bitcoin Memes IRL. They tweeted a meme saying, "Tomorrow be like," and it's Woody pointing over a Buzz Lightyear and says, "Look, a Strategic Bitcoin Reserve." And then Buzz looks and there's nothing there, and Woody laughs. Ha 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 ha. That aged well, and it only took an hour for it to sour. All right. This, of course, was a special, almost emergency episode of the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast. We do special episodes from time to time, but we usually only get together on Wednesdays when we recap the news and, of course, do our weekly DCA Wednesday stack. So don't forget to join us in just a couple days while we make our 190th weekly Bitcoin purchase to add to that stack. If you are new to the Bitcoin Bulletin Podcast, we have been doing this for almost 4 years now. Beginning back in July of 2021, we started stacking Bitcoin every week, and we started stacking just $20 worth of Satoshis every single week to explore the power of Bitcoin and specifically the concept of dollar cost averaging, especially in just small amounts of fiat, to show that you're not too late. It is not too late, even for those of us who only have modest amounts of fiat to convert into Bitcoin. And I think it's been a pretty successful experiment. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. We've stacked 189 Wednesdays in a row. And over those 189 Wednesdays, stacking just $20 a week, we managed to stack more than 10 million Satoshis, or roughly 1/10 of a Bitcoin. If you're just falling down the rabbit hole, a Satoshi is the smallest unit of Bitcoin. There are 100 million Satoshis in a Bitcoin, so 10 million Satoshis is 0.1 BTC. And currently, our more than 10 million Sats are worth approximately $8,600 despite the fact that we stacked less than $4,000 to do so. And of course, by dollar cost averaging, we managed to stack those sats at a relatively fantastic price. Because we stacked all the prices, we stacked all the way up to the 2021 high and then all the way down to the low, and we're stacking all the way back up. Our average purchase price, our dollar cost average, is just $36,153.08. So we're doing pretty well, even with a little bit of pullback from that all-time high. So if you want to learn more about DCA and why you were not too late, please go back and listen to the previous episode where we explained just that. And then, of course, don't forget to join us in just a few days when we do it all again. But before I go, I want to ask you to please help support this podcast by feeding those algorithms. You can do so by sharing this podcast, by leaving a comment or a review. And of course, make sure you're following us on Twitter or X. Remember, we are at BTC Bulletin Pod, at BTC like Bitcoin, Bulletin Pod like Bulletin Podcast. I absolutely love to hear from you as well. So you can say hello, you can say hi by sending us a DM on X. And again, that's at BTC Bulletin Pod, or by sending me a good old-fashioned email at bitcoinbulletin@protonmail.com. Again, that's bitcoinbulletin@protonmail.com. My DMs are open. I do reply to them, and I have my email open right now, and I reply to them as well. And it's just great to hear from y'all. It's really cool that we have listeners all over the world, and getting to hear from some of you from time to time is really what makes it all worth it to me, sitting here in front of this microphone, doing this podcast. But again, don't forget to join us this Wednesday and every Wednesday while we grow our stack of sats together for as long as someone's still willing to trade us Satoshis for worthless paper fiat. But until that time, keep on stacking those sats, you sexy sat stackers.